When my grandpa, Reverend Ralph Donahue, died, my grandma asked a minister by the name of Gilbert Guffin to preach the funeral. And at the service, Guffin explained that Reverend Donahue, my grandpa, had preached the sermon at his ordination. And so as best he could reconstruct it, Guffin preached that ordination sermon as the funeral sermon that day. It was very touching. So, Cathy, I want you to take really good notes on my sermon today, because I'm expecting a lot from you when I get called home to glory. But no pressure, right? I'm just teasing. Besides, I want to go to heaven, but I'm not ready to get on the bus just yet. And anyway, I feel a little jubilous standing up here talking about a calling that I have practiced now for almost 4 decades without ever feeling any real sense of expertise about it. Like most of my ministerial colleagues, at least those who will admit it out loud, I'm still groping my way through this stuff. Years ago, a friend and fellow minister, an accomplished counselor, a man that I deeply respected, said to me, "You know, Paris, I wish you were the pastor of the church I attend." Well, I was flattered, of course, and I should have let it go. But I just couldn't resist fishing for a compliment. And so I asked, "Well, why is that?" And he says, "Because you don't work so hard at doing it right." I didn't know whether to hug him or slug him. But you know, in the ensuing years, I have learned to wear those words as a kind of badge of honor. You can't do ministry by the book. Yes, in the U.C.C. we have a manual on ministry, but being a pastor is always a fly by the seat of your pants enterprise. You make it up as you go along. I mean, think of it. You can gauge how well a farmer is doing by the size of his harvest, right? You can gauge how well a salesperson is doing by the numbers in his or her customer base, but ask a minister how he or she is doing, and they'll say, "Well, I've been sort of going forth and holding forth and so forth." So I'm just going to suggest a few rubrics for you to inscribe on the tablets of your heart from this day forward, and hope that they're helpful. They aren't terribly profound, but they are life-changing. The 11th chapter of Hebrews has sometimes been called the roll call of the faithful because of that long list of biblical characters mentioned. The writer talks about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and a host of others, and those folks accomplished a lot. Their successes were phenomenal. But they achieved what they did through faith, because faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith, he writes, our ancestors received approval. So it wasn't by force of will or higher education or a big bank account that these characters accomplished what they did. It was by faith. And lest we start thinking that faith itself is an accomplishment, I remind you of Paul's words in Ephesians, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It's the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." So ministry is not about accomplishment. Ministry is about God's grace. It's not about what I achieve. It's about what God does. You and I are just invited along for the ride. Now, I know, whether we will admit it or not, we clergy types can be just as competitive, just as driven as any corporate manager. I've seen it. In fact, I remember my very first day on the job and my very first call after seminary in the dinky little town of Palmetto, Georgia. I was sitting in my desk working away when I looked out the window and there was Jesus staring at me through the window. He was just looking at me. He wasn't saying anything. He wasn't doing anything. I tried to ignore him, but he just kept staring at me through the window. So finally, I called up the executive of our local Baptist association, Arvie Thornton, and I said, "Hey, Arvie, it's Paris Donahue. You know, the new pastor out here at Sardis Baptist Church?" Yeah, thanks, I'm fine. Listen, it's my first day on the job, and Jesus is staring at me through the window. What am I supposed to do?" And there was a long pause on the other end of the line, and finally Arvie said, "Look busy." The world will tell us it's all about looking busy, being productive, bigger numbers this year than last year, but that's a lot of hooey. We're called to be faithful, not successful. There's a difference. You and I are called to work and work hard, but the results are not in God's hands. They're not in our hands, they're in God's hands. Years ago, I heard theologian Fred Craddock tell about meeting a man while he was waiting to get on a plane in Kansas City. The fellow was from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and he was in the United States studying the influence of conversation between doctors and nurses during surgery on a patient's post-operative recovery. He had discovered, he said, that even though a patient is under anesthesia, he or she is still influenced by the mood in the operating room. For example, he said if the doctors and nurses were negative and irritable and snippy with each other, the patient took longer than normal to recover. And if the doctors and nurses were cheerful and upbeat and happy, then the patient recovered more quickly. And after the man had been through all this data with Craddock, he said, "Now, why are you interested in this? Are you a medical doctor?" And Craddock said, "No, I'm a preacher. But if it'll work in surgery, it'll work in the sanctuary." And so ever since then, ever since I heard Craddock tell that story, I've never been bothered when people fall asleep during my sermons. I just keep right on preaching. Because I know that long about Wednesday or Thursday, old Rip Van Winkle is going to start feeling a little Christian and not know why. Ministry is not about accomplishment. It's about God's grace. It's about the stuff God does with us and without us. On good days, that truth sets me free. On bad days, I have to go back and learn it all over again. And so will you, Cathy. Ministry is not about accomplishment. It's about God's grace. Or to put it another way, ministry isn't about leadership. Ministry is about discipleship. Do you need to be a leader? Of course you do. Do you need to collect a toolbox full of leadership skills? Absolutely. But when the water hits the wheel, when the challenges facing your church in Sedalia, Missouri look bigger than a boarding house cat, and you wonder, what in the world am I going to do now? That's when the Bible becomes more than grist for next Sunday's sermon. That's when the silence of your life becomes a canvas for God's guidance. That's when the eyes of the homeless woman you helped stare back at you with Jesus' eyes. That's when the words of the old hymn become the port in the storm you need. Sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of care. In today's other reading, God tells Jeremiah about plans for the prophet's welfare. But God doesn't tell Jeremiah about a leadership conference going on in Las Vegas. God doesn't tell Jeremiah to pick out a few books from the leadership section of the Christian Century spring book issue. No, God says, when you call upon me and come and pray to me, I will hear you. When you search for me, you will find me. If you seek me with all your heart, I will let you find me, says the Lord. You see, the specifics of following Jesus may be different for clergy because of the specialized work that we do, but the basics of following Jesus are the same as they are for everybody in the pews. Those 6 marks of discipleship that Lois talked about so eloquently this morning in our worship. Pray daily, worship weekly, read the Bible, serve people inside and outside the church, relate to others for spiritual growth, and give of your resources. You don't get a buy from those 6 marks of discipleship. It must be practiced, if you'll pardon the pun, religiously. Ministry isn't about leadership. It's about discipleship. When William Willimon was university minister at Duke University, a student came to him one day and asked, Dr. Willimon, how do you deal with people who hate you for being a Christian? Willimon was stunned by the question. He said, hate you for being a Christian? He said, son, I'm a Methodist. We haven't had anybody hate us in a long time. Why do you ask? And the young man said, well, I was sitting around the frat house the other night talking with a bunch of guys, and the subject of this war in Iraq came up. Everybody in the room was in favor of it, except me. They thought it was a good idea. So I said, I didn't think it was a good idea. And they wanted to know why. And I said, well, I'm a Christian. And Jesus never fought back when he was attacked. He told Peter to put away his sword when the soldiers came to arrest him. In the Sermon on the Mount, he told us to love our enemies. So I just think this war is a bad idea. And Dr. Willimon, they all got mad at me. They told me to move to Mexico or somewhere. One guy was even crying. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with people who hate you for being a Christian? And Willimon said, son, I want you to give me the name of your pastor of your Baptist church back home in Mississippi. And I'm going to write to him and say, Reverend, you may be a failure in every other aspect of your ministry, but I want you to know you're getting through to this young man, and he's on the loose. Leaders don't get through to a young person and turn him loose on the world. Disciples do that. Will you be a perfect disciple? Of course not. Will you do discipleship more faithfully than the folks in your church? Some days yes, some days no. They will look to you for leadership. But if you're smart, you'll practice discipleship. And the leadership will fall into place. Not because you get it right, but because you get it true. John Claypool used to tell a story about a Benedictine monastery built high on a hill overlooking a small town. And because it held such an exalted position, and because the monks rarely ventured outside the walls of their cloister, the place took on a kind of holy aura in the minds of the people. Well, one day one of the monks was traveling along a road at the foot of the hill, and a woman walking the same road saw him and came and fell at his feet and blurted out, "Please tell me, Holy Father, what do you men of God do in your monastery up there so high on the hill? It appears so close to heaven. How do you spend your days and hours?" And the monk replied softly, "What do we men of God do in our monastery so close to heaven? I'll tell you, my child. We fall down and we get up. We fall down and we get up. We fall down and we get up." I told that story to another church, and a lady was listening with her little grandson, and when I got to that part about we fall down and we get up, fall down and we get up, and the little boy said, "And we get a boo-boo." Cathy, you know that following Jesus means falling down and getting up again. Ministry is when you get to help others get up too, especially those who get a boo-boo.